Kate LaFalcia. Welcome to Irish Granny. Welcome back. This is part 2 of our Saturday book, A Threat to Deceive, the search for the real killer of the Lindbergh baby by William Norris. We're on chapter 4. This is the second video, chapter 4, What Happened to Baby Charles? So they had high hopes. They broke the news to Ira and Wilson of the Treasury Department. These are the guys that are, hunting immigrants. The Treasury guy was really upset that the gold certificates were held back because they could have been traced easily. Lindbergh pulled strings for a Navy plane to search for the boat, and they searched the area around Elizabeth Island for the boat Nellie. They inspected many boats. They used the Coast Guard, and nothing. He was despondent. He went home to Hopewell, and as the author put it, Lucky Lindy had been duped. And it was his own fault because he kept the law enforcement and the FBI at bay. He kept them out of the investigation. He may not have even given the money to the real kidnappers, but to some extortionists because he gave copies of the original note to Rosner, the gangster. People knew how to fake second and third notes. Who knows who it was? The next day, he went up in a plane and flew in wider circles. He had Condon do another ad. What is wrong? Have you crossed me? Please, better directions. Signed Jaffsey. Got no response. Finally, he allowed Schwarzkopf to make a public statement that the ransom had been paid and no child had been returned. Lindbergh secretly asked the press to soft pedal the story, especially that the Treasury Department was hunting for the serial numbers of the bills. The papers published the serial numbers. Unbelievable. Jaffsey had given them the information. He loved the spotlight. April 16th, they got a new lead. A boat builder, John Curtis, had already had unsolicited leads. 38,000 letters, 12,000 from Dreams, 11,500 from sympathy cards, 9,500 suggestions, and 5,000 cranks that were screened by the New Jersey State Police. But this boat builder, John Curtis, came recommended. You can trust him. If he's got a lead for you, you can trust him. So responsible people told them he's not one of the crackpots. His claim was that he met the kidnappers, 5 Scandinavians. The leader's name was John. A German nurse was with them. She wrote the notes. Curtis, the boat builder, met John at a house on Cape May. The plot originated with an employee, apparently of Lindbergh's. They visited the Hopewell house 2 or 3 times. John and another guy had climbed a ladder, chloroformed the baby, carried him out of the house and out through the front door. Took the baby to Cape May and then on to Martha's Vineyard, and the proof was he had some of the banknotes. The new demand now came for $25,000 more. It said, pay it soon. The underworld is trying to get the baby and are offering big money. So pay it soon or we're going to give the baby to the mob. The baby was alive on a boat called the Mary B. Moss off New Jersey and would be transferred to a 2-masted 80-foot schooner near Block Island. This just gets more and more arcane. Anne, Schwarzkopf, Breckenridge, they did not believe any of this. Lindbergh was grasping at straws. So with Schwarzkopf, the search began, and he ordered him to say nothing to the public. The search began for this boat that they described. Lindbergh searched by air with Curtis, and then he tried an 85-foot yacht he loaned from the Curtis' friend, and they scoured the coast, the whole coastline. They returned to port with nothing. Lindbergh stayed on the boat, and Curtis went on to Atlantic City to try to get contact with the mob. May 12th, two men, Allen and Wilson, were going to work, and they were in a car within eyesight of the Lindbergh house. They stopped to pee in the woods, and they found the baby's body. The cops came. They found a blood-stained burlap sack along the road, and then they found that actually the body had been buried in a shallow grave and had been disturbed by animals, and the animals had pulled the burlap sack. So the baby had been in a burlap sack. Schwarzkopf inspected the body and was notified. Lindbergh was at sea in this boat waiting for Curtis. Curtis was later fined for obstruction of justice. I'm not quite sure why. The next day, a formal identification was made by Betty, the nanny, the nurse. The death was by a fractured skull, and it had happened 2 to 3 months previous, so probably when he was kidnapped. How was the skull fractured? Was it fractured in a fall from the ladder? Was it fractured accidentally in a panic? It seemed very severe. It wasn't just one whack on the head. It seemed deliberate. And even today, this is an interesting little side note, even today, people pop up who claim to be the Lindbergh baby. And you know, they've all been proven otherwise. They can't check the DNA of the baby because Lindbergh had the baby cremated immediately. I guess what they do is they get DNA from family, and they couldn't be related. Chapter 5, the doctor's convoluted defense. There was universal grief, cards, flowers, gifts, telegrams. There was anger on the part of the public at the loss of the perfect family. Lindbergh was a huge hero, a man of myth. Hoover declared that the federal law enforcement would dedicate 100% to solving it. In June, Congress declared kidnapping a federal crime. This gave the FBI carte blanche. The New York State investigation was huge. All the people with safe deposit boxes in March and April, their signatures were checked. All tax returns were examined. All unclaimed bodies were checked in case John had been killed by an associate for the money. All former 50,000 students of Condon were checked. The New Jersey police, a guy called Walsh, suspected the maid, Violet Sharp. She wasn't in the house that night. She'd worked that day. She'd taken a phone call early in the day that the baby would be at Hopewell that night. The Lindberghs were elsewhere, and they called ahead to say, we're coming, we're bringing the baby, we're staying for the night. Because they had staff in 2 places. So if the kidnappers were strangers, were they tipped off? If they were tipped off, who were they tipped off by? Violet. And she was so harassed by the police that eventually she died at her own hand. Her alibi was she was at a speakeasy with 3 friends drinking coffee. This author researched her alibi and tracked down her friends. This is, a long time after. And he said they were iffy. They were bootleggers. And this was the end of Prohibition. It was starting to be ending. And were they upset they were going to be losing money? Was this a quick get-rich-quick scheme to get some easy money? They did live near Condon. And the question is, were they connected to the mob? Walsh, let's see now, who was Walsh? There's so many people at this point, I'm losing my mind. Walsh was never investigated. Sorry. Walsh never investigated these friends. My shorthand, He looked at Condon, and Condon was the only man who met with this guy, John. Condon claimed he talked to John, several times, once for more than an hour. It's all very suspicious. It's his word and there's no evidence. But Walsh didn't investigate any of this stuff. At this point, no one was aware yet that Condon had cared for Dwight Morrow's illegitimate son. Nobody knew there was a connection between Condon and the Morrow family. Condon was brought to look at mugshots and grilled for 4 hours. Walsh is with the police. Walsh thought the ransom was raised from $50,000 to $70,000 to keep Condon quiet. It was like a bribe to keep Condon quiet. So the question is, why did Condon put an ad and replies in such a small local paper? Wouldn't you want to advertise this all over? Why not the New York Times? And his answer, when he was asked, was, I didn't think of it. They asked him again to describe John, and he gave a much more embroidered note, including that he thought that John had tuberculosis. Now, keep in mind, he's not a medical doctor. They searched Condon's house. They dug up the grounds around his summer house. They tapped his phone. They went through his mail. This drove the cops crazy because he was so... he was just completely erratic and bizarre. He was falsely IDing all sorts of prisoners and suspects and photos, and then he was trying to confuse the cops, is what he was doing. The New Jersey police called him a screwball, a wacko, if not guilty, then mentally deranged. A journalist made the statement to the police about it in an interview with Condon that he did on May 14th, 2 days after the body was found. And this is what the journalist said about that talk with Condon. He said, Condon said to the journalist, supposing there was a family in which most of the members were bad, one of them was very good, and suppose the good one came to you and went down on her knees and asked your protection, wouldn't you do everything to shield her name? So this journalist is like, what are you talking about? Who are you talking about? And Condon said, no, I'll carry her name to a secret to the day I die. Well, was he just trying to look important? It wasn't Anne. Anne didn't get down on her knees to Condon. She never left the house after the kidnapping and was never alone with Condon. However, was it Elizabeth Morrow? Elizabeth Morrow was the widow of Dwight Morrow. Dwight Morrow was Anne's father. And was she trying to keep secret that her husband had an illegitimate son who was connected to Condon? Is that the woman who got down on her knees and begged Condon? Chapter 6, Justice One Way or Another. The public was completely obsessed with this case, and it was a distraction from the ravages of World War I and the Depression and the increasing unrest in Europe. Just it had been a difficult couple of decades, and this was just a great distraction. When the author of the book began researching it in 1989, Anna Hauptmann, the German guy who was executed, his wife was still alive and still fighting to prove that he was innocent. So he died in 36. This is 89. We're talking 53 years she'd been fighting for him. The author heard her being interviewed on a car radio, and this changed the next 15 years of his life, this book. Robert Bryan was the attorney for Anna Hauptmann, and in 1986, there was a suit over the Hearst Press and New Jersey officials because of this. The author had just finished another unsolved case, another book, and he was inspired by Lindbergh, and also he had heard Bryan say that he knew who the killer was. So these different things, he was finished one job, between jobs basically, finished a book. He was a flyer and was inspired by Lindbergh. So that motivated him. And then thirdly, he heard this interview, and the attorney said he knew who the killer was. And this Brian attorney agreed to talk with Norris in San Francisco. Norris went. He said it had a very unprepossessing office. And Brian, the lawyer, refused to tell Norris who. Here's an intriguing fact. The daughter of the former New Jersey Governor Harold Hoffman, not to be confused with the accused and executed Hauptmann, so Governor Hoffman found a collection, his daughter found a collection of Governor Hoffman's papers in the garage, 20,000 pages of papers. He had launched a major inquiry to prove that Hauptmann was innocent and to stop the execution. And this investigation, at his instigation, ruined his political career. He was the governor at the time. His daughter put these papers on display in the Trenton Public Library. They did a little trip down memory lane. These are papers from the Lindbergh case. And during this time, Brian, the lawyer, copied them. So he had copies of all of them, which is a good thing, because when the New Jersey cops got wind of the existence of these papers, they came and took them all away. In 1989, Brian had sole access to all these papers he'd copied. Today, when he wrote the book in 2020, they were public. But in 1989, they were still secret. The author says, well, I knew they had to contain something. And there was enough in some of these papers somewhere to convince the governor that Bruno Hoffman was not guilty, and to go and risk his career and actually lose his career. There had to be something pretty persuasive in these papers. And the lawyer, Brian, wanted a contract signed with the writer to get a big chunk of money from the book in order to allow the author to see the documents. And the author said, no, I'm not signing away the money from my book to you. I need to see some of the documents. And the attorney said kind of reluctantly, oh, okay. So Norris, the author, went in to look at the papers and discovered that they were completely disorganized. They were in no order of any sort. So at complete random, this is a great story. At complete random, he just reached in and grabbed a bunch of the papers. And what did he find? This is just a story. This whole book is crazy. What did he find? He found a letter from Rosalind Russell, the actress, that she wrote to J. Edgar Hoover in November of 1934. It told the story of a conversation Rosalind Russell heard in a speakeasy. Rosalind Russell was not famous yet. She was living in New York. She was in a speakeasy. She overheard a conversation. It bothered her so much that a few years later, when she had broken into Hollywood and was famous, she wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover. And this conversation that she overheard was about the son of Dwight Morrow Sr., Senator Dwight Morrow, Anne Morrow's father, the grandfather of this dead baby. The story goes like this. In 1911, 8 years after he was married, Dwight Morrow seduced and got pregnant a housemaid. He would have been ruined if this had been made public, and he had a burgeoning career. He had his eyes on high political office. He was a lawyer who had started working for J.P. Morgan. He had been made the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. He was talked about as a possible presidential candidate, but he died of a stroke. 1931, he died of a stroke. So this nursemaid got pregnant, and he wanted to hide it. So the baby, Morrow, Senator Morrow, arranged for this baby to be sent to France to live with a French family, a foster family. And Morrow made regular payments through an intermediary, Condon. Rosalind Russell recognized Condon's name from the news because now this case was so public. And the rest of the story is that the boy had heard that his father, of whom he was the illegitimate son, that the father had died. Morrow, Senator Morrow, had a stroke. He wanted his share of the estate. So he went to the house and he demanded from Elizabeth Morrow, the widow, he and Lindbergh, $50,000, give me $50,000. And they both refused. And he left in a rage. He threatened revenge on Lindbergh. Lindbergh had the boy put in a psychiatric hospital because he wasn't stable. He escaped from the psychiatric hospital and legitimately, you'll see, this did actually happen. There was somebody of that name in the psychiatric hospital, and he did escape, and 2 days later, the baby was kidnapped. So there's a lot of confusion. What was his name? Is he Dwight Morrow Jr.? Are there two sons? The illegitimate son? We're going to keep referring to him as the illegitimate son, and an older son, Dwight Morrow Jr., who was also schizophrenic. This illegitimate son, there was somebody in the mental hospital associated with the Morrow family. That's documented. So the author said that these files were so messed up. It was too difficult to quickly find out facts. But he didn't sign a contract. And Brian had demanded most of the proceeds from the book. And they parted on what the author calls frigid terms. The author headed for the Craig House Sanatorium in Beacon, New York. He never admitted to Brian that he had this letter from Rosalind Russell and he knew this information. So he had a little bit of a clue to go on. Chapter 7, The Craig House Escapee. New York State had a place called Beacon. It was a hospital. And in 1989, it was still in operation, but today it's abandoned. It was once a renowned treatment center for the elite and the famous. For example, Zelda Fitzgerald went there. The new head, Dr. C. Vardopoulos, the building in 1989 was still open, but had been and was being run by Dr. Vardopoulos, but it was now mostly rehab, drug rehab. So the author met with Dr. Vardopoulos, and he, the doctor, denied knowledge of any of this. He says, 1932, way before my times, no records exist. The author said, are you sure? The doctor said, well, you can go ask the previous owner, Dr. J. Slocum. He's alive, and he lives in the town of Beacon. This is the Beacon Hospital, basically. So he turned to leave. Norris said, thank you, Dr. Vardopoulos, thank you very much, and maybe I'll go talk to Dr. Slocum. Turned around to leave the office, and on the wall by the door that he was going to exit through was a photo of doctors and nurses on the staff and Charles Lindbergh. Why? What was Charles Lindbergh doing at this hospital? This was not commemorating like a ribbon cutting or something. This was just he was hanging out. Why? Could he have been visiting a patient? So the author went to the library to look at the local paper from 1932, in which every move Lindbergh made was documented, and there was no story of him ever being at the hospital. When he came to Hopewell, it hit the paper every time. They showed up at the house. They're in their house this weekend. Had he been to the store, that was publicized in the paper. Had he gone to this hospital, everyone would have known about it. But the author knew he saw that photograph, And he wondered, could this have been a secret visit to a patient they didn't want anyone to know? So he went to see Dr. Slocum. At the time he went to see him, he was 76. He died in the year 2000, but this is 1989. And he was delighted to get a visitor. He said he had a vague memory of a patient going AWOL in the 30s, but he had no memory of meeting Lindbergh. He did know, however, that records from 1932 were in a green file in the attic of Craig House. They still existed. Dr. Vardopoulos, the new guy at the rehab, he didn't realize that they were still up there in the attic. So now it's 2004, and the author is working on this book, and he has, Dr. Slocum has died, and it's several years since they had a conversation. He wants to go check on these files that are ostensibly in a green file in the attic of this abandoned now Craig House. And he gets there, but it's locked up tight, and he's afraid of being charged with burglary because the police have been so weird about the whole case from the very beginning, and still are so weird about the documents, and still were. So he was nervous to incur the wrath of the police, and he decided to go to the cops and see if they had a missing persons report for this escaped patient. So he went to the police department in Beacon, and he said he was met by this friendly, smiling desk cop who said, "Oh yeah, well, our records of that are in the basement, and if you come back in the morning, I can let you in. I can't access them myself, but come back in the morning and we'll let you into the basement, and you're free to go through the records." So he came back the next morning, and it was the same cop, and he was rude and unfriendly and curt, and he said, "Stop poking your nose into things that you don't know about and get out of town." And he went out to his car, the author did, and he said he turned his car on, and a cop pulled in behind him, and the cop car followed him to the city limits. So who would be responsible for this level of secrecy? And he found out that the prosecutor, his son, was now the chief. The prosecutor in the case of the Lindbergh trial was utterly relentless. His name was David Willents, and we're going to talk more about him. But the author found out that his son was now the Chief Justice of New Jersey, and he had already refused to reopen the case, and the author is asking himself, could it be possible that New Jersey and New York are in cahoots? I mean, still today, what is going on? So now we're at chapter 8. Who tipped off the kidnapper? This would make a hell of a podcast, wouldn't it? So they looked at the case again, and he said, he looks at the case again, the author does, and he says, could he fit the story to the facts that exist? So he's kind of doing a comparison between the official story but the facts that he knows are true. So was there a Violet Sharp? Yes. She was 27 years old in 1929 when she came from England to Canada. She was hired as a waitress. Imagine you have waitresses in your house. By the Morrows, who had 29 servants, and she waited table, this was her job, at Next Day Hill Mansion in Englewood, their big mansion. She is the one who took the call from Anne the morning before the kidnapping. She was in the Hopewell house, took a call from Anne that the baby had a cold, and that they were coming and would stay overnight at Hopewell at the new house. And Anne wanted Betty Gow to be at Hopewell too. So this was very unusual. They had never stayed at the house, and they'd never stayed on a weeknight. They'd gone on weekdays, weekend weekdays, but they never said on a weeknight. So who told the kidnapper? How did the kidnapper know that they were going to be there? There were always people at the house. There was a staff that lived there and ran the house, even though it was brand new. Somebody had to live there. It was in the middle of nowhere, and they needed security. So they had the Watleys, and they had apparently other random staff that left in the day after the end of the day. And one of those was this Violet, this maid. So immediately, Violet fell under suspicion as a confederate of the kidnappers. Did she tip off the kidnappers, hey, they're going to stay overnight with the baby tonight? Two other possibilities were Betty, the nursemaid, or the chauffeur who drove her, Henry Elefon. Violet, her alibi was a lie. She said she was at the movies that night. She got off work and left the house, and she was at the movies, but she wasn't. She was described as very odd, shy, moody, high-strung. She claimed she was married in 1929 in London to a guy called George Payne, but there's no record of any marriage at all. In 1926, they met. They were both servants in the same house. He was 63 in 1932. He had been married 36 years. He was not known to have had a relationship with Violet. What is with this story? Her story does not match up to the reality. There was a guy that existed. They did work together for a while. But he'd been married for decades, and nobody confirmed ever that they'd had a relationship. She claims they were married. Well, they weren't married. There's no record of it. He was already married. So this story is full of confusion, but that's an example. Violet's behavior was questioned. She had an affair with Morrow. She had an affair with a Morrow butler. And his name, the best name, Septimus Bank. Septimus means, essentially number 7 in Latin. She had an affair with him. She got pregnant and had an abortion, and that was a big, scandal, hard to get in those days. Lindbergh had caught these two servants in the act out one night by the pool. Did she have an affair with the illegitimate son? So what they're implying here is this woman went from guy to guy to guy. She was a kind of an unstable character in general, and her behavior was erratic. Lots of lies, lots of weird things going on in her periphery. Did she have an affair with this illegitimate son and tip him off that they would be there that night at the house with the baby? Did she inadvertently tell somebody in the family? And then did she later suspect that they might have been involved? The Morrows were pretty lax with their help. For example, the Septimus Bank character that Violet had an affair with was drunk quite often at work, and he was often referred to, he'd been fired and rehired, and he was often referred to as a high-class drunk. Then there was Mrs. Graham. Mrs. Grimes Graham was the English housekeeper. She was a 45-year-old widow. She took kickbacks from the local shops for purchasing things for the Lindbergh family. Then there was George Cow, the gardener. He stole gas on a regular basis from them. Henry Ellerman, the chauffeur, had friends over to the pool whenever the family was absent. Eventually, he got a DUI and lost his license, but instead of firing him, because he was a chauffeur, he needed a license, they gave him the job of watchman. In 1934, a guy called E. Riley, who was an attorney for Hauptmann, got a letter from a private eye. And this private eye was named Pettit. And he said that Ellerson returned to the Hopewell to the city of Hopewell. After he got out of work, he took their car and left. Came back later that night with an unknown passenger about 3 o'clock in the morning, and then left again with that same person. His handwriting was said to match the ransom note. The Department of Justice had copies of all of this, but they took no action to investigate this. So there's a thread that just left dangling. The staff at the house in Hopewell had weird inconsistencies and disturbing backgrounds. What went on with them? Nobody ever investigated. Walsh, the cop, he questioned all the servants against the wishes of Lindbergh. They were all cleared except for Violet. She lied at the first questioning, and in later sessions she was cold, described as cold, abrupt, defiant, and surly. She changed her story. Remember, she claimed she went to the movie? That was her first story. But it was a lie. And she changed that to say, well, I really didn't go to the movies. I went to the Peanut Grill. This is like a bar restaurant with 3 friends, and I was home by 11-ish. The date she was with was a casual guy who had given her a ride while she was walking with her sister. She didn't even know who the other couple was. So she's one of a couple, and then there's 2 more people, 3 friends and her. And she barely knows this guy. He picked her up on the road. And apparently the girl asked her, how's the baby? This couple showed a weird interest in the baby. This was the only date this guy ever asked her on. She saw Betty on February 29th playing cards at the old house, not the Hopewell house. And she knew that Betty was going to the Hopewell house with the baby on March 1st. The investigator never asked her, did you tell anybody that the baby would be at Hopewell? Then she had another interview 9 days after the body was found, and she was just out of the hospital after having a tonsillectomy. And it was only a 6-minute talk because she could barely talk. She was a total physical wreck, was written down. And did he ask her the question, who did you tell that the baby would be at Hopewell? Because shortly thereafter, she was dead. Her bank statement was not remarkable. She didn't collect money. The only odd item that they found in her property was a business card of a William O'Brien from New York City. He was a young drugstore assistant. He was a soda jerk with engraved cards. Very odd. In 1936, an informant told the police that Violet and William had had an affair. Who was William? I'm not taken aback here. The question in the book is, who was William? He was long gone. There was no phone. It was disconnected. Was this the connection to Dwight Morrow Jr.? Was this the illegitimate son? So they're still not certain. Are there 2 sons? Dwight Jr. living at home and schizophrenic, legitimate, and William, illegitimate, guardian, Condon, also schizophrenic. Is there only 1 son? I mean, they still don't know yet. This is all unclear. And it's hard to follow because the author is trying to decipher what's going on based on all of this really poorly researched evidence, or trail went cold. So Violet lied. She said she had no friends. Well, she went dating a guy called William. She had a friend somewhere. And the cop was suspicious about this. And he scheduled a police car to go get her and bring her to headquarters for questioning. But when they got there, they discovered she'd taken cyanide. She had drunk silver cleaner. Why? Guilty conscience? Nobody knows. The cops found Ernie, this is the date that picked her up on the road, who took her to the Peanut Grill. And it's true, they were at the Peanut Grill. They were not at the movies, as she had said at first. So that kind of went nowhere. Chapter 9, At a Loss for Words. Almost all the parties involved in this are dead when he started to write the book. Betty Gow, the nursemaid, was still alive. The first suspect was Betty Gow, because she went, to Hopewell and was in charge of the baby, and she might have told somebody. Was it intentional? She had a Norwegian boyfriend, and she called to cancel her date with him that weekend because, as she told him, she was going to Hopewell. Is this Scandinavian with the German accent? Anyway, he was arrested, found to be here illegally, and deported after questioning, and they said that he wasn't guilty, wasn't involved. Betty was described as devoted to the baby and devoted to the Lindberghs. She actually became the nurse to the second baby that was born after the kidnapping, and she returned to Scotland during the trial. And the question was asked, and still being asked, was she sent to Scotland by Lindbergh to avoid testifying during the trial? Also, Violet's sister, the one who was walking with her when the guy picked her up, was she still alive? So the author decided to go to England to find out. He had lived there as a child, so this is not all that incredibly unusual. He had lived in Hastings as a child. And he discovered that Edna, Violet's sister, lived in his old neighborhood. So she agreed to meet with him. And it turns out the sisters were not close. Edna left after the kidnapping, but before Violet died. She had returned to England, and it was completely independent of anything that was happening in Violet's life. They weren't close. She just decided to go back to England. She really had no information. So then the author found Betty Gow's house, but a very unfriendly, middle-aged gatekeeper shut the door in his face. It felt suspicious. First the cops in Beacon changed their tune overnight and followed him out of town. And now this woman refused to let Betty talk to him. Was there a cover-up going on? So he waited. He hung out in the neighborhood and watched for this minder to leave. And he rang the bell again. There was no response. And he left a note. And there was no response. The author met with Linda Kennedy, who wrote a book called Ehrman and Carpenter that talked about Lindbergh and Hauptmann. And he believed that Hauptmann was innocent. And this was actually an old friend of the author. I don't think I got that first name right. It looks like Linda. It might have been Ludo, and I apologize, but my handwriting is abysmal. Once I get going taking notes for several hours, it turns into hieroglyphics. But Ehrman and Carpenter should be a pretty easy book to find. He was married. It is a guy. His name is not Linda. He was married to Moira Shearer, the actress, the old actress. She had been a ballerina, and then she became an actress. I loved her in movies. And they lived in England. And he'd never heard of the Rosalind Russell letter. He'd never heard of the illegitimate son. And he wrote one of the most definitive books on the case. So he wished the author luck. These are good friends, and he says, oh, good luck with this because it's impossible to get information. Chapter 10, What Rosalind Russell Overheard. So his publisher refused to advance him money. Anne Morrow Lindbergh was one of their most profitable authors, and they were not going to make her mad. So he set the project aside until 2003. That's why it's so much time went by. And he mentioned this letter from Rosalind Russell to a friend. And he was introduced to a researcher. Now, this researcher apparently is respected and professional and wishes to remain anonymous. But he was introduced to this researcher in Paris. And the researcher was a big fan of Lindbergh and total skeptic about Norris, the author's case. He didn't believe anything at all about the Rosalind Russell letter. He said this is all just nonsense. And he didn't believe that Lindbergh was involved in a cover-up. He thought that this letter that the author had seen was fake and was planted by the lawyer to try to get the author to agree to sign over the money of the book. So he discovered, going through all the documents, that he could not find this letter. However, he did find something else more interesting out. Rosalind Russell told the story that was in the letter, told the story to the Philadelphia Record's investigative reporter, David Stern. And he told his father, who was the president of the New York Post. And he told the editor of the New York Post, who told the FBI. So Special Agent Siri went to Philadelphia to interview David Stern, the reporter for the Philadelphia Record, on June 25th, 1934. So Rosalind Russell, in real time while this was happening, she actually was upset that nobody responded to her letter. So she told the reporter, who was a friend of hers, who told his father, who was a big shot newspaper man in New York. He told the editor of the paper. The editor called the FBI. So the story was that the maid had an illegitimate son with Dwight Morrow. And the wife, Elizabeth, knew all about it. And they gave money to Condon to care for this child and to arrange his education, find him a foster family, send him to good schools, keep it silent. Morrow died. He had a stroke. And he did not leave his children in his will. The money stopped immediately. There was no more money paid to Condon. And the kid went to Condon and said, where's my upkeep money? And Condon told him, well, your father died. And he didn't know, who he was related to. He just knew that he got money every month from his father. And now the story comes out. Your father was Dwight Morrow, father-in-law of Lindbergh and senator. So this kid, he's not much of a kid. He's like in his early 20s. He went to New Jersey, contacted Elizabeth Morrow and I guess Lindbergh, and demanded from each of them, one after the other, $50,000. So here's where this. If you think this is weird, Elizabeth, the cuckolded wife, invited her husband's illegitimate son to stay in her house. Oh, he was 25. Stay in her house while she decided what to do. So he had an affair with this maid, Violet, who died at her own hand. That they had planned the kidnapping as a prank. They were going to hold the child hostage for money. He'd get his money. She'd benefit somehow from it. They didn't think the Morrows would prosecute them even if they found out, because of the scandal of him being the illegitimate son. The maid opened the nursery window for him to get through it. On the way out, this stupid ladder broke and he dropped the child. He panicked. He put the body in the woods and he fled. Elizabeth Morrow immediately knew what had happened. She immediately knew it had to be him. And why? The money. The money. It's interesting that the kidnapper asked for the same amount of money that he had demanded from her. She told Condon what her suspicions were. He gave $50,000. She gave Condon $50,000. He gave the $50,000 to the illegitimate son. Then Condon made up this whole story. The entire story about contacting the kidnappers, etc., 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 made the whole thing up. Lindbergh was not aware of the illegitimate son until Elizabeth provided the $50,000, and then, Lindbergh had to be in on it. Lindbergh was told by Condon while on the boat searching at sea. That's why he didn't get off the boat. He was upset. And he lost all interest in the search and the return of the baby and the capture of the kidnapper at that point, which he did. He just completely obstructed everything because he knew the story would come out and destroy his wife's family. Stern told the FBI that he had immediately informed the New Jersey State Police that there was nothing to the story. Nothing to the story. The special agent found Rosalind Russell. She confirmed the story. She repeated it. She knew one of the people that she overheard telling the story. She knew this was the personal attorney of Senator Morrow, a guy called Charles Fay. The other two people with Fay seemed to know the bartender. Russell was on her way to Hollywood and stardom the next day. She gave the special agent her Hollywood address, but he never got in touch with her. And therefore, 6 months later, she wrote the letter to J. Edgar Hoover and expressed her frustration that nobody had done anything about her story. And Violet was not at Hopewell that night. And not one other person in the story was questioned about any of this. Only Violet, and you know what happened to her. So the special agent went to the New Jersey State Police. Now these are the people that Schwarzkopf is in charge of. And his report says that a lieutenant that he talked to told him that from time to time the state police received reports of rumor to the effect that the kidnapping was carried out by the illegitimate son of Dwight Morrow, and that extensive investigations by the state police have definitely established the falsity of this rumor. Never, ever was Elizabeth Morrow interviewed. Never was the private attorney Fay interviewed. And all of the Condon interviews that he did, and there were many, because, he never saw an interview he didn't like, made no mention of the illegitimate son. But there were other transcripts with Condon that were kept away from Governor Hoffman, from the Hauptmann defense, and never revealed. So now we have the Morrow family's secret. A lot of other people believed the scandal of the illegitimate child of Senator Morrow, including Governor Hoffman. He believed it. And he received many, many messages from people saying, hey, we know about this. There is a legitimate son, Dwight Morrow Jr., and he did have schizophrenia. And he was said to have a breakdown when Anne announced her engagement. And he was hospitalized at Craig more than once, several times. And while he was there, there's a record or a story that he was visited by the senator. He was visited 3 times by Lindbergh and his sister, Anne Morrow. So by 1932, and the kidnapping, he was back at Amherst. This is the oldest son, Dwight, the schizophrenic, out of the hospital. Apparently he was brilliant. He graduated in 1933. He had a PhD from Harvard. He was not feeble-minded, but he was sick. And he would have occasional need to be hospitalized. It's not known where he was on the day of the kidnapping because he was never questioned. This is the oldest son. When he was told of the kidnapping, He told the New York Times that, oh, well, I'm staying at Amherst, and he did not visit his sister. He did not go to Hopewell, and he had no comment. Very oddly dismissive is how it was described. He was whisked off to Europe after the body was found, and the FBI became involved. They sent him off to Europe. Governor Harold Hoffman's theory was not made public, but he told his wife that the prime suspect was Dwight Jr. Dr. Slocum, the guy that was the head of the psychiatric hospital, Craig House, agreed. Dwight Jr.'s first wife is still alive, and she was still alive during the time he was researching the book, but she wouldn't talk to him. Letters from Governor Hoffman show his dislike and distrust of the Morrows and the Lindberghs. So this is his theory. And we're talking now about not Dwight Jr., but the illegitimate son. He mentions a foster son. He warned Elizabeth. He mentions that a foster son warned Elizabeth that you will all be sorry for this right before the kidnapping and murder. So Dwight Jr.'s better, and he's at Amherst, and he's emotionally detached from the whole thing. Meanwhile, foster son figures out who his family is, his biological family, comes to Elizabeth, the wife of his father, and the widow of his father, and says, you don't give me the money, you will be sorry for this. And 2 days later, the baby was kidnapped and murdered. The Hoffman, I think, believed about the relationship with Violet, and that she knew more about all that went on. And why was this illegitimate son never researched? Why would they all assume that nothing would be made public? And why does Condon avoid telling the truth? Why did he not reveal the relationship with this illegitimate son? Well, I think, how do you spell psychopathy? And the main question here is, after all, why is this holy, H-O-L-Y, American family, and we are all honorable Americans who ask this, why are they holier than anyone else when it comes to matters of justice? And this is Hoffman's words. The sense of human decency demands that this man have fairness. He's talking about Hoffman, and that is all. And then he says, we're all tired of legal frauds who are Morrow and Lindbergh, that they go scot-free of any kind of investigation, of any kind of revealing any kind of bones in the family closet. And why is this bastard son so completely protected? And of Hauptmann, he says, the story follows. Dwight Morrow had 5 children: Dwight Jr., Constance, Elizabeth, Anne Lindbergh, and William. When Mr. Morrow died, he disinherited the latter, William. All of his possessions were left to Mrs. Morrow. Now, this is the illegitimate son, is William. Left her that she should take care and provide for the first 4 of the above-mentioned children, but made no mention of the 5th, William. When the will was read to the family gathering by the attorney for the family, it has been said the boy remarked, somebody will pay for this. And he says that Mr. Morrow left this boy out of his will because of the fact that William Morrow was mixed up in some gang and kidnap scandal prior to the making of the will. This was not his first rodeo. So the governor laid out things that needed to be investigated, and they were never addressed. And actually, this is untrue. What the governor said, it's slightly untrue. Morrow didn't leave his children out of his will. He put the decision-making in his wife's hands. So no children were mentioned other than, I'm giving you, my wife, control over the inheritance of all my children. My children, not our children, which is a very interesting choice of words. He said, my kids, not our kids. And why did he avoid using any names at all? Well, I think it was to hedge around the issue of the illegitimate son. And interestingly enough, the agent from the Department of Labor who identified the boyfriend who Violet had called him William. Where did he get that name? Because this fifth child named William was not recognized by the family and not spoken of. The other agent asserted that Hopman was innocent and the Morrows were guilty. There were also claims that the body was not the real baby, and they were covering up all of this, and that's why it was cremated immediately. Both Violet and the Watleys, the butler Watley, the man, killed themselves within a year. And there's question, did he leave a signed confession? When Governor Hoffman began investigating, all the principal witnesses, Elizabeth, Lindbergh, Anne, and Condon, went abroad. The prosecutor wrote to Hoffman, all the rumors were investigated and there's no basis for any of them, and he threatened the governor's career. The big fear of scandal of massive proportions was that the real scandal was the oldest son, Dwight Jr., had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals. Okay, now I'm going to call that the end of this video. And so this is the end of video number 2, and we'll be back with more. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's not too confusing. It does actually all become clear at the end, but it's kind of like we're walking through this muddled evidence with the author. He's describing the process of him becoming aware of what truths were true and what information was lies. And it's really interesting how this was manipulated. And it's, I think, a nice departure from our troubled world. The troubled past is much easier to cope with. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know if you're enjoying this. I can always do more books like this, you know. And in the meantime, Slongafoil, Slancha.